So as a kid, I always loved holiday specials, especially Halloween, obviously. Whether it was a cartoon, a sitcom, or a comic book, holiday specials always put you in the spirit for whatever holiday they were about. But as an adult, the holidays can feel so much harder to enjoy. Between personal struggles, awkward encounters, or sometimes just outright estrangement with family, and so much chaos going on in the world at large right now, the magic we felt as kids around the holidays can feel more like a phantom memory than an attainable joy. So now that I have a YouTube channel, I figured why not try to provide some source of holiday joy or entertainment if at all possible, like that which we used to experience as children. And there's one particular character that I'm pretty certain all of us fawn over that is certainly capable of giving us that childlike excitement again. So let's have our own little Spider-Man Thanksgiving here. So if you can't sit down and watch this video, maybe put it on while you drive to your family's gathering or do whatever holiday prep work you need to get done. Or put it on if you're stuck working a Thanksgiving shift. Trust me, I've been there plenty of times and I know it sucks. So the way I'm going to structure this is by going through each decade since Spidey's creation in 1962 and covering the basic history, premise, etc. of any major Thanksgiving-themed Spidey adventures or events, whether it be a Thanksgiving-themed issue in the comics or one of the floats at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. There's not a whole lot of Thanksgiving Spider-Man stuff out there, so this won't be anything like the Spider-Man Christmas special, which is probably going to be gigantic. Hope you're ready for that one. So, without further ado, here is the Spider-Man Thanksgiving Day special. So there's not a whole lot of Thanksgiving history for Spidey in the 60s, but what does take place during the 60s is wildly fascinating and pretty historically significant. I'm sure most of us know about the annual Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade that's taken place in New York City since 1924. One of the most iconic balloons in the parade is none other than our friendly neighborhood wall crawler, first appearing in 1987 through 1998, and then briefly again from 2009 through 2014. But before Spidey's helium-filled debut at the parade happened, actor Scott Leva donned the Spidey costume for the first publicly official time in 1981, and Spidey appeared again in live action in 1982, though I'm unsure if this one was Scott or not. But even before those live action appearances, Spidey was supposed to appear in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in the mid-1960s. Our story starts with comic book writer Roy Thomas, whose credits include co-creating Wolverine, Ghost Rider, Luke Cage, and Carol Danvers, amongst a lot of other amazing work, hanging out in the Marvel offices, circa late 1965 or early 1966. Marvel's production manager, Saul Brodsky, whose time with the company dated back to the early 1940s with the proto-Marvel Comics publishing company Timely Comics, and whom Stan Lee described as his, quote, right-hand man for years, unquote, as Brodsky had been a key player in many of Marvel's comic book titles and expansion as a company in general, had revealed several costumes to Roy that Marvel had commissioned someone to make for use in either the 1964 or 1965 Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. These costumes included unisex Fantastic Four outfits, Spider-Man, and even the Wasp and Medusa, according to Roy Thomas. Apparently, Brodsky had told Roy that the actors that Marvel paid to wear these in the parade had gotten drunk the night before the parade and never actually showed up to carry out the job. So with Stan Lee's permission, Saul had offered the costumes to Roy to clear some space up in the offices. So Roy took these costumes and actually donned the Spider-Man suit a number of times throughout the years. The earliest documented appearance of Roy in this suit comes from a 1966 Comic-Con, in which he is standing next to a classic Cyclops and Beast, in addition to a photo of him standing near Captain America, who was Dave Armstrong underneath the cloth. I'm pretty sure this would technically make Roy Thomas the first live-action Spider-Man, if you're not counting some obscure 1965 fan costume photo or something. But I'm pretty sure the first Spider-Man fan film is from 1969, so yeah. He then wore it in the annual Rutland, Vermont Halloween Parade in 1969. The Rutland, Vermont Halloween Parade was run by a man named Tom Fagan, who was an avid comic book fan, and in turn had plenty of early costume superhero representation at these parades. This kind of representation was so exciting and appreciated by comic book writers at the time that stories about the parade were actually written in titles such as The Avengers and The Justice League of America. In fact, Roy Thomas himself wrote some of these stories. So Roy had decided to show up in costume at the 1969 Rutland, Vermont parade as Spidey, along with his first wife and Marvel Comics writer, office assistant, and colorist Jean Thomas as the Invisible Woman. Roy has recounted that it's possible he could have first shown up to the Rutland, Vermont Halloween parade as Spidey in 1966. We can see a photograph of Roy and Jean in these costumes from an issue of the comic fanzine Comic Crusader number 8 from 1970. That same year, Roy had written one of those Rutland, Vermont Halloween parade stories in Avengers number 83, in which Jean and Roy are depicted wearing these very costumes. Roy also appears wearing this Spidey costume in Batman number 237, Justice League of America number 103, Amazing Adventures number 16, and The Mighty Thor number 207. By the way, I briefly covered Justice League of America number 103 in my Spider-Man's Weirdest Crossover Comics video. A photo of Roy in this Spidey suit was used in issue 11 of Marvel's satire book Not Brand Ech from autumn 1968, though the image was so low quality that it was then reprinted in another issue of Not Brand Ech in issue 13, 4 months later. An image of Spider-Roy hanging out with Stan and company in his office was printed in Fantastic Four Annual number 7 in 1969. Roy would don the Spidey threads once again at a special Stan Lee appearance at Carnegie Hall in January of 1972. The last time Roy recalled wearing this costume was in the late 70s, with comic book writer and his now wife, Dan Thomas, who was also dressed up in the Invisible Woman suit. Roy kept this costume in his possession until January of 2017, when he handed it over to John the Mego Stretch Hulk Cimino, who I've briefly mentioned before in my first Spider-Man Iceberg video, as he was the one who brought that 50s Ben Cooper proto-Spider-Man costume to light in that New York Post article from 2015. Most of the information I've used to cover this Macy's Spider-Man costume actually comes from the blog Hero Envy, which chronicles a lot of Roy Thomas's stuff and is written in part by John Cimino. Roy and John showcased this historical costume at the Big Apple Con in March of 2017 to commemorate both Spidey's 55th anniversary that August and the then upcoming release of the film Spider-Man Homecoming. The suit was sold in January of 2018 to a private collector. So as you could probably tell by looking at the pictures of the costume that have been on screen, it looks pretty funky. Of course, there's the fact that not only are there holes where the lenses should be, but also a mouth hole too. But you can chalk that up to a low-budget, low-tech design of the mid-1960s. The front spider looks a little messed up, but the back spider emblem is straight-up Ditko. Really, the overall design of this suit is straight-up Ditko, seeing as he would have been the main Spider-Man artist when it was made. One thing that's kind of odd about it, though, is the fact that the legs are purple instead of blue. Roy Thomas has joked that the person who made the suit probably wasn't paid enough to truly consider such finer details like this, but John Cimino has an interesting theory as to why the suit is colored this way. In some of those early Ditko books, the blue parts of Spidey's costume almost look more like a lighter purple. Perhaps the seamstress or tailor or whoever only had these issues to reference when making the suit, got confused, and just decided to incorporate both colors as a failsafe. Maybe, but we'd have to consult the person who made the suit to get a definitive answer, and unfortunately, that person is currently unknown. When John Cimino initially asked Roy Thomas about the history of this suit, Roy actually emailed Stan Lee and tried asking him if he remembered who made the suit. This was Stan's response: "Roy, you're incredible. You not only remember the events, but the dates as well. I remember the events you mentioned only vaguely. Hell, people sometimes ask me when I moved to LA, and I can't even answer that. Wish I could help you, but I don't even recall some of the stuff you mention. Your memory is absolutely a national treasure. Should be donated to the Smithsonian. Excelsior, Stan." So while searching for any Thanksgiving-related Spidey adventures from the 70s, I was accidentally sent down a bit of a rabbit hole, looking for something that I almost thought was lost. I found a post by Eric Engelhard on spiderfan.org from 2002, which revealed something that I never knew about. So I'm sure many, if not all of you, know that Spider-Man was featured in the children's television series The Electric Company in the 1970s. The Spidey segments featured a speechless Spider-Man going on child-appropriate adventures, speaking exclusively through speech bubbles. It felt like a live-action comic book, literally taking place in a comic panel. There was an eponymous companion comic book Marvel published that ran from 1974 to 1982, with a total of 57 issues. Yes, of course, I'm talking about Spidey Super Stories. These comics have produced some of the funniest Spider-Man moments ever, with supervillains like The Wall and Funny Bunny. There's also the classic "this painting looks the way I feel" meme, and the iconic lightsaber duel with Dr. Doom, amidst a sea of other hilarious stories. It's definitely well known among Spider fans, but what I didn't know until reading this blog post was that the actual Electric Company magazine that produced the show that Spidey Super Stories originates from was also publishing its own original Spider-Man short stories that were also called Spidey Super Stories. So you have the Spidey Super Stories original comic books, which spawns from the Electric Company, and you have the Electric Company magazine printing original Spidey Super Stories exclusive to that magazine, and they were simultaneously being printed. Yeah, it's hard as hell to try and find these original stories online, in no small part due to the fact that most searches are just going to bring up the Spidey Super Stories comic. Eric from spiderfan.org says that he only found these Electric Company magazines by going to his local library. One of the stories he describes involves Kang traveling back in time to 1620 to try and ruin the first Thanksgiving until he's stopped by Spider-Man and Lockjaw. Now, Eric says he photocopied these magazines, but I don't know if he put any of those scans online. I had no idea which issue this would have taken place in, and Eric says there were at least 80 issues of the magazine with original Spidey Super Stories. Luckily, he did archive the covers and story titles of these Electric Company magazine issues though, and this Spider Thanksgiving tale takes place in issue 100. Okay, great. There's only one problem. This shit cannot be found online. All I could find was the cover, and I almost gave up on looking for anything else before I started writing this segment of the video. However, I did end up finding an eBay listing of this exact issue, and the seller included a picture of the first page of this story in the listing. I was so excited to find this image. If anyone out there has access to this issue, please upload scans of it online. It seems like these stories are way obscure, and I just need to see the rest of this Thanksgiving ridiculousness. So the 1980s is where we get to our most iconic Spidey Thanksgiving Day connections. Starting in 1981, Spidey made his parade debut in the form of Scott Leva, who was Marvel's in-house Spider-Man for many years, and almost the first actor to play Peter Parker in a major motion picture, donning a Spidey suit and doing some acrobatics around the parade. Man, that suit looks great. On December 26th of 1981, the 16th episode of the 1981 Spider-Man cartoon, simply titled Spider-Man, aired and showed a Thanksgiving Day parade that had a Spider-Man balloon. This episode actually predates the Macy's Spider-Man balloon by a full 6 years. Pretty cool stuff. Also, man, I love this cartoon. I used to watch some of these episodes as a kid on old VHS tapes my dad had, since you could never find the show on DVD back in the day. The music, the character designs, the webby transitions, just perfect. The next year, a live-action Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends trio showed up in the parade. I'm not completely certain if this Spidey was played by Scott Leva or not. I really need to get his book he just released and see if he mentions it in there. You should too, by the way. 5 years later, in 1987, Marvel debuted not only their superhero-packed float, but also the iconic Spider-Man balloon. So how did this iconic piece of Spidey history come to be? The idea of a Marvel float and balloon was actually that of Marvel's then owners, New World Entertainment. Macy's in-house staff were the ones that physically constructed all the balloons and floats, while sponsors contributed designs and approved what got worked on. The balloons are prototyped with clay models in Jersey City, and the final designs are sent elsewhere to be constructed. At least, that was the case at this point in time. According to Jim Shooter, it would cost anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 to have a balloon and float in the parade in those days, which would roughly be anywhere from $832,000 to over $1,110,000 today. So when Marvel started butting heads with the designer of the balloons prototype, they obviously had to do something about that. Initially, veteran Spider-Man artist John Romita Sr. was brought in to advise the sculptor on how to improve this design, but that didn't end up panning out, as any suggestions John made were tossed aside by the apparently egotistical sculptor. Again, this is according to Jim Shooter. Joe Calamari, Marvel's business affairs vice president, then contacted Jim Shooter, Marvel's former editor-in-chief, who was fired a mere month before this, to come in as the new consultant for the balloon's design. As Joe and Jim were on their way to the balloon shop in Jersey City, Joe had explained that the sculptor of the Spidey balloon had not only rejected John Romita Sr.'s advice, but also wasn't taking much inspiration from the specific artwork Marvel had given him to reference. Joe also claimed that John didn't have the same understanding of 3D objects that he did with 2D drawings, which is apparently why he brought Jim Shooter into the fold, as Jim had experience with toys from Marvel's old licensing deals. Once Jim got to the balloon shop, he described what he saw as being, quote, amazing, clay sculptures of many past years' balloons all around, and several new ones in progress for 1987. Among them, Ronald McDonald, Snoopy on skates, and what appeared to be Spider Baby in the midst of a strenuous bowel movement. Yeah, Jim Shooter describes this initial sculpture prototype as having the proportions of Richie Rich while doing a pose very similar to this image, except the pose had the figure even more, quote, scrunched up in a straining to poop position, unquote. What a lovely image that conjures up, huh? When Jim went to suggest that the prototype needed a makeover to the sculptor, he was apparently met with immediate condescending resistance. As Jim was talking about the proportions being off, the sculptor countered with the fact that these proportions were necessary for the balloon to actually work in real life. But Jim stood his ground, and despite the sculptor's proclamations of the apparent impossibility of Jim's proposed new proportions and posing, Jim had pointed to the Ronald McDonald balloon as evidence that Spidey's reimagined angled pose would actually work. The figure was ultimately remodeled into the now iconic balloon that ran from 1987 to 1998. While Jim was dealing with this sculptor's inflated ego, something had occurred to him. It was less likely the case that John Romita Sr. didn't get through to the sculptor because of unfamiliarity with 3D objects, but rather the fact that John probably didn't have the heart to challenge a fellow artist on an area of expertise that he himself wasn't that well informed with, seeing as how pushy the sculptor got with Jim. After the figure had been corrected, Jim then told Joe to bring Romita back into the fold to paint the webs on the costume to ensure it was visually accurate. As far as which sculptor Jim Shooter says he had such a difficult time with, I'm not exactly sure. This first balloon is credited to John Romita Sr., Nicholas Gamarello, and Manfred Bass. Nicholas Gamarello is a painter and designer, and Manfred Bass was the head designer that actually worked on constructing these balloons. Manfred Bass would go on to call the Spider-Man balloon a true, living, flying piece of sculpture. From that quote, I suspect this is the sculptor Jim Shooter didn't get along with, seeing as how he's taking a big sense of pride in the actual sculpture itself. Manfred apparently stated that this was his favorite achievement out of his decades-long career as the head designer of the Macy's Parade balloons. He was very thrilled with the sculpture's human-like muscle tone, which was a new achievement for helium balloons. The balloon was constructed at the Raven Aerostar headquarters in South Dakota. Raven Aerostar produced the Macy's Parade balloons from from 1983 through 2019. The Spider-Man balloon was 78 feet long, 36 feet wide, and 400 pounds in weight, with 9,520 cubic feet of helium volume. Spidey was even shooting a little web line out of his hand, which is just awesome. This classic crawling pose, accompanied by Milton DeLugg's rendition of the iconic 60s cartoon theme, is just so joyful to look at, man. I just love it. Truly an iconic piece of pop culture history. Also, notice how one of the co-hosts of the parade, Willard Scott, refers to his arch nemesis as Octopus, the Green Goblin.
He's got spiderweb rays coming out of his hands. He can cling to tall buildings, and he's looking for Octopus, the Green Goblin.
The float was a fan favorite and was christened the official superhero of Macy's Parade in 1988.
He's been dubbed the parade's official superhero balloon. Hey, I thought that was my title.
From 1988 through 1992, the float had a Spidey cam, which was almost like a POV shot from the perspective of the balloon. In 1989, the float experienced its first of many major incidents. The balloon got knocked into some ice shards, having its left leg punctured. At some point, the balloon then apparently, quote, collapsed into a heap of rope and nylon, unquote. Apparently, Jim Shooter was also involved with designing the 1987 Marvel float, in which he sketched out a cross-section of New York City showing sewers, lower levels, street level, Doctor Doom's laboratory, Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum, and various skyscrapers, with each Marvel character coming out of their respective setting. Jim also suggested that a building tipped over when the Hulk came out and pushed it. We can see that those ideas came to life in the final product. Multiple actors appeared in glorious comic book accurate suits, playing Captain America, Doctor Doom, Wolverine, Daredevil, the Hulk, the Green Goblin, Magneto, the Enchantress, Iron Man, Silver Surfer, Emma Frost, Luke Cage, Doctor Strange, and even RoboCop? Yeah, RoboCop shows up for a brief second to help out Doctor Doom, which sure is strange to look at now. At the time, Marvel were publishing RoboCop comics, which explains his appearance. Also, no. There was no Spider-Man actor, even though the Green Goblin was there. Apparently Marvel thought that there shouldn't be both a Spider-Man float and a live-action actor, as they thought it might, confuse the kids watching. Bizarre. There were also giant comic book pages representing each character on the float. Doctor Strange seems to summon Cap right out of one of these comics in the beginning of the float's segment. Then the heroes all run around the float, fighting the various villains scattered about, and the segment ends with Captain America fighting the Hulk for some reason. Though that is actually on brand for the amount of times the Hulk's reckless rampages needed to be stopped by the Avengers. I love how you can see the Hulk quickly fixing his mask after trying to give himself a concussion for some reason. There's heroic-sounding pre-recorded voice lines for the heroes, and the whole thing is set to the Back to the Future theme music, which is kinda odd, though it does fit pretty well. The next year, the same float and cast of characters, with the addition of a live-action Spidey, returned with a musical number, One Moment in Time, performed by the Boys Choir of Harlem. Olympic champions Jackie Joyner-Kersee and Janet Evans also boarded the float. In 1989, the Marvel float made its final appearance with their special guest singer Melba Moore performing Hold Out for a Hero. I love how the hosts reference Wonder Woman as they're introducing the Marvel float.
Dr. Doom is lurking, but we know that the Incredible Hulk and Wonder Woman are going to triumph.
Also, is it just me, or does that Silver Surfer mask look kind of creepy? According to Steven Vratos, who played Spider-Man in the Shea Stadium Spider Wedding, which I covered in my second Spidey Iceberg video, and also played Iron Man in the first two Thanksgiving Day parades and Magneto in the last one, Marvel had decided to give the Silver Surfer a smile on his mask because they thought his often solemn appearances wouldn't connect with the little kids watching the parade. What an uncanny effect that had, huh? Steven said that people actually ended up mistaking the Surfer for another character all along the parade route, as parade goers kept yelling, "Hi, Casper." Steven also says that the reason Marvel retired the superhero float is because the option to have a float in the parade has to be renewed and approved by sponsors every 3 years. Once that time is up, You have to buy a new 3-year contract, then get approved by sponsors, and then create an entirely new float, as to avoid clogging up the parade with stale repetitiveness. I don't think it's too shocking that a pre-MCU, pre-Disney bought out Marvel Comics didn't spend money on another contract for another float. Of course, before we leave the 80s, we can't forget to mention Amazing Spider-Man issue 313, released in November of 1988, in which the Spidey float is possessed, thanks to the events of the Inferno storyline going on in the X-Men world at the time, and has to be popped. Get it? Instead of stopped. I like how when Spidey pops the balloon, he comments on how the eyes looked wrong, a nod to how McFarlane had completely reinvented Spidey's costume design at the time. In 1991, USA had a Thanksgiving Day special called Spider-Mania, in which they marathoned the 1977 Spider-Man TV series for, I believe, 2 days, though the YouTube channel that uploaded this noted that each marathon was 6 hours, not the entire day. I absolutely love these little bumpers that just have a still image of him and Spider-Man swinging around palm trees and crawling up a building with a giant turkey in the window. This must have been such an exciting experience for any Spider fan in a pre-internet, pre-Raimi trilogy world. Now, let's get back to the float. The Spider-Man float briefly appeared outside of the Thanksgiving parade, once in 1989, and lastly in 1990, at Macy's Eagleston Christmas Parade, before being pulled out of the event, as Macy's stopped being a sponsor in 1991. Apparently, the float was also spotted at a Macy's-sponsored parade at the grand opening of the Mall of America in 1992, which was the largest shopping mall in the US in its day, located in Bloomington, Minnesota. In 1993, the float experienced another technical difficulty, in which a gust of wind had blown the head of the float into a tree branch and popped it, though it was able to finish out the parade's route. In 1997, a live-action Spidey, donning the classic Universal Studios Spider-Man costume, can be seen leading a grounded Spider-Man balloon, which was kept very low to the ground due to horrible wind gusts. Multiple balloons had suffered wind-related damages that year, with the Cat in the Hat float knocking off part of a lamppost into the crowd, injuring 3 people and sending 1 woman into a coma for a month.
Suddenly, it knocked.
Yikes. The float was supposed to appear in the 1998 parade, but ultimately never made it. Because of what happened with the Cat in the Hat float the previous year, 2 utility vehicles had been attached to the bigger floats to keep them under control this time around. Unfortunately, the weight of the float being anchored to the vehicles caused the balloon to rip before Thanksgiving Day. During the broadcast, though, they replayed old footage of the float, so at least they still tried to include it.
Unfortunately, before the parade, the Spider-Man balloon developed a technical problem, so we're going to show you Spider-Man on tape from a previous parade.
After this, it was decided to retire the balloon, though apparently they did end up repairing this original float, only for it to sit the rest of its days out in the Macy's warehouse until its fabric started to deteriorate. In 2005, it was completely disposed of. So, we just have to talk about the Thanksgiving scene in the first Raimi Spider-Man film if we're going to talk about Spidey and Thanksgiving. I won't analyze it too much, as this scene has been talked about quite a few times online, but man do I love it. This is my second favorite film ever, so I could just go on and on about the first Raimi Spider-Man movie in general for hours, let alone this scene. Obviously, this is an extremely pivotal moment. The moment that Norman finds out Peter's secret identity. The way Norman's demeanor starts to fall apart as soon as he realizes what's going on with Peter's bike messenger incident is just fantastic. The fact that Norman is wearing Spidey colors, Peter's wearing Gobby colors, and Harry has a mix of both is also just perfect for where all of these characters are at this point in the film. Honestly, this whole scene is full of banger moments. I adore that fiery transition at the beginning of the scene as Norman is trying to come out of goblin mode. Peter's joke about beating the old lady with a stick for the cranberries is so goofy. Norman's menacing stare at May as he does the honors is great. His douchebag moment as he goes on an audible misogynistic rant about MJ to Harry in the hall right outside of his apartment is so awkward.
Do what you need to with her, then broom her fast.
Then the fact that Harry takes out his frustrations from dealing with his father's neglect for years on MJ right after this moment really highlights how troubled and misguided he is from dealing with Norman's less than stellar parenting all of his life.
So just keep your mouth shut about stuff you don't understand.
Poor MJ. Poor Petey, too. The dinner that's supposed to make him feel grateful for the few people in his life that he's genuinely close with not only falls apart, but actually ends up being the catalyst for the most stressful and dangerous scenarios of his life up until that point. What a perfect encapsulation of the Parker luck. Speaking of a perfect encapsulation of Peter Parker, let's move on to our next Thanksgiving-related Spidey media from the 2000s. I believe the spectacular Spider-Man needs no introduction. It's often considered the best Spider-Man cartoon, and for good reason too. It really characterizes the ethos, moral dilemmas, and struggles of Peter Parker so well, it's spectacular. This particular episode captures not only this sentiment unsurprisingly well, but also Venom's character. This is the 13th episode of Season 1, the season finale, titled Nature vs. Nurture. It takes place on Thanksgiving Day, and acts as the conclusion of this series' Black Suit saga. Peter has already rejected the symbiote, and Eddie Brock has now bonded with it to become Venom. Also, it's important to note that Aunt May is in the hospital, recovering from a recent heart attack. Throughout the episode, we see Venom instilling a sense of fear into Peter by showing up to his house, threatening his loved ones, and overpowering him, all before revealing his identity. Spidey has no idea who's doing this at first, and it's just brilliant. Much like the 1994 animated series before it, I really think this show got the essence of Venom's early evil days so right in this episode. When people nowadays talk about Venom originally being evil, I don't think they fully realize that's not really true. Venom was never a straight-up evil villain. He was an obsessive hater of Peter Parker. Yes, the character is an absolute psychopath, but he's always had a twisted moral compass that would prevent him from flat out doing unequivocally evil things like someone like the Green Goblin, for example. Really, he was only a true through-and-through villain to Spider-Man, and this series nails that on the head. See, I'm a huge Venom fan. I'm actually shocked I haven't spammed this channel with Venom videos yet. Like, Venom is without question my second favorite comic book character ever, right behind the webhead. I even won an award for scariest costume at a Halloween party when I was 8 years old for it. My life peaked there. So all that to say, I'm a bit picky when it comes to Venom's various portrayals in the media. I'm not really a fan of Venom's voice in this. It sounds too weak and obviously vocoded.
We know who you love the most, bro.
It's not nearly menacing or deep enough.
Get back here. Not too far, little spider. No wall crawling.
I'm also not that big of a fan of the influence the Ultimate Comics had on this version of the character, but it's written so well that it doesn't detract from this version in any meaningful way for me. The personal connection these versions of the characters have with each other makes it actually that much more believable that Eddie would hate Peter for making him lose his job and neglecting their friendship, and the suit hates him for rejecting it. It's definitely a good way to strengthen the bond between Eddie and the alien. I can't remember if they focus on Venom's moralistic side later on in the second season or not. I'd have to rewatch. But this initial Venom episode just gets it so right. It's close to perfect, and condenses the early David Michelinie Venom story so compactly into a single episode. Eddie shows up to Aunt May's house, terrifies Peter's main love interest, randomly ambushes Peter, and ultimately loses the symbiote to Peter because he begs for it to rebond with him, knowing that the suit is basically a bitter ex that he dumped. The fact that the show has explicitly shown Eddie Brock being a loner throughout the series really makes his bond with the suit just that much better. This really does capture the whole idea that Venom is only the sum of Eddie Brock and the Black Suit forming a relationship out of their extreme anger over the various rejections they've dealt with. Venom's not just the name of an alien that uses a random meaningless host to do evil bad things. There are a lot of elements like this that seem to have gotten lost in translation in Venom's media adaptations over the years, but I'll save that rant for another video. Peter denying the suit's influence over his mind because he regained his strength via the people he loves in his life is a great visual metaphor for being thankful for your loved ones on Thanksgiving as well. All in all, Thanksgiving is just a really good excuse to watch this great adaptation of Spidey and Venom. Next up, we have a classic YouTube series. So Marvel used to have a satirical stop-motion series called Marvel Superheroes What The, which was also the name of an old satirical comic book they used to publish, that uploaded a Thanksgiving special in 2009. The premise of this little 3-minute short is that various Marvel characters are pitching balloons of their likeness to Macy's to get into the parade. I love seeing all of those old Marvel Legends figures that were everywhere when I was a kid. Also, it's still pretty humorous. At the end of the episode, we see that Spider-Man is the only one who got a balloon in the float, which perfectly coincides with the real Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Yep, that's right. In 2009, the Spider-Man float finally made a return to the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. This time, the float incorporated the web shooting pose, along with a more updated look for Spidey's costume. The updated look can be attributed to an artist who is a staple for many of our childhoods. Scott Johnson. Scott was hired to paint a new version of the costume on the new balloon model, which he did in Photoshop by digitally painting the costume onto photos of the model taken from various angles. Now, isn't that a cool piece of trivia? This new Spidey balloon was 78 feet long, 37.8 feet wide, and 29.1 feet tall, with a helium volume of 11,800 cubic feet. The float was once again accompanied by a rendition of the classic 60s theme song by Milton DeLugg. After years of fans asking for Spidey to come back to the parade, this float instantly became a fan favorite once more. In 2011, there was a pre-parade medley performed by members of the infamous musical Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. The Spidey float this year also had a live-action Spidey following it around in that ever-so-nostalgic Universal costume. In 2013, the float's left arm was punctured by a Central Park tree, but still finished the parade route. 2013 also spawned an infamous image on the internet, which appears to take place the morning of the parade, with the Spidey float on ground level right behind the Uncle Sam float. And I mean right behind it. The float was repaired and appeared the following year in the 2014 parade, though this was the last year the second Spidey float showed up. Well, that was a disappointingly short run. It's already been a full 10 years since we've seen this thing. The parade just hasn't been the same without it. The float has made a couple of brief appearances in the comics since then though, like in a couple panels of the Seasons Beatings holiday one-shot from 2018, for example. Speaking of comics, there's actually a couple Thanksgiving-centered comics involving Spider characters from the 2010s. First, in 2016, we have Spider-Gwen issue 14, which revolves around Gwen Stacy finding things to be grateful for in her life, despite the many problems she has, such as making a deal with the Kingpin to try and get her father out of trouble, and her strained relationship with the Parkers due to the circumstances surrounding Peter's lizard death. But despite all of the troubles in her life, a nice Thanksgiving meal and pep talk from Spider-Woman herself, Jessica Drew, gives her a moment of gratitude for all that she does have. Also, the Kingpin in this universe is Matt Murdock, complete with a red suit instead of the classic white getup that Fisk is known for. That's really fun, I dig that. Next, we have the Thanksgiving one-shot, Marvel Mealtime Mayhem, from November of 2018. This is a children's comic book containing 2 short stories and a few cute extras thrown in for good measure. Our first short story shows Venom robbing a pie store for, well, pie. So it's up to Ghost Spider, to stop the robbery. I like how Venom is only robbing the store because he didn't have money for a pie. That seems like something his 616 counterpart might have done in the old days. Taken some food, but not actually robbed the place of its money. Those messed up morals make for some weird scenarios. Next, we have some fun games for the younger demographic this comic is aimed at, along with some faux classic comic strips in a Marvel style. I absolutely love the Spider-Man Charlie Brown comic. I love Spidey's webs being a substitute for Linus's security blanket. Man, Spider-Man and Charlie Brown have a lot more history together than people realize. Next, we have a little story showing Spider-Man helping Thor track down Mjolnir after it somehow went missing. Loki shows up and reveals it's he that stole the hammer. So what does Spidey do? He uses Loki's arrogance against him and doubts his capability of stealing Thor's hammer so much that Loki summons the hammer from across dimensions just to prove to Spider-Man that he did really have the ingenuity to steal it, which of course leads to the heroes beating Loki and moving on with their day. We get a little message about Thor being thankful for his dad believing in him as a child, and the story wraps up. Once again, this actually does feel like a mental tactic the 616 Peter would use to defeat a villain in a situation like this. Nicely done. So I was contemplating skipping the 2020s since we're only now reaching the halfway point of the decade. And yes, that sentence terrified me as much as it did you. But there's already been a few Thanksgiving-related pieces of Spidey media released, so let's go ahead and include this segment here. Maybe in 10 years, someone else will make a Thanksgiving special that covers the second half of the 2020s. Wouldn't it be cool if they mentioned my Thanksgiving special as well? Just layers of Thanksgiving special. Like a YouTube casserole. What the fuck am I talking about? Let's get on with it. So, although there hasn't been a Spider-Man float since 2014, a live-action Spider-Man did end up making a return at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in both 2022 and 2023 on Disney's Magic Meets the Sun float, which is a promotion for the Disney Cruise Line. Also, Black Panther appeared alongside Spidey both years. If anyone has any little ones at home, this next entry will make a great pairing for that Marvel Mealtime Mayhem Thanksgiving comic. The animated show Spidey and His Amazing Friends had a Thanksgiving-themed episode in 2022 called Halted Holiday, in which we see Doc Ock, who's actually the Carolyn Trainer version Lady Octopus, in an evil Octo-Santa sleigh causing traffic delays in the city. It's pretty standard fare for this kind of kids show, but I absolutely love that they put the Octobots in this. If we ever see a new Doc Ock in live action again, we need to see more of Ock's criminal side, like the Octo Squad and all of the cool gadgets like this. Next up, we have a two-part story that takes place in Spider-Boy, issues 1 and 2 from November and December of 2023. For those who weren't aware, Spider-Boy, aka Bailey Briggs, is a young boy who obtains spider powers after being captured by the evil scientist Madame Monstrosity and having his DNA spliced with that of a spider. He's got all the basic Spider-Man powers, minus the web shooters, and then some. His spider sense basically picks up psychic links to endangered people around him, giving him visions of their recent history and current whereabouts. He maintains this psychic link until the endangered person has been successfully saved. Also, he's immune to Spidey's spider sense because why not, I guess? Spider-Boy also has a venom bite, as in he can bite and poison people like a real spider. Also, he stays at Feast, which I'm sure most of you know as the homeless shelter Aunt May worked at, as well as the famous Mr. Negative, and is good friends with Christina Shu. He was wiped from reality for a while until being resurrected again by Neith, but now nobody remembers he existed in the first place, so that sucks. Anyway, back to the story. Bailey and Christina are at the Thanksgiving Day Parade when Bailey decides to suit up as Spider-Boy so he and Christina can get a better view at the floats from the rooftops. Atop a building, Spider-Boy runs into Squirrel Girl when all of a sudden a balloon floats into his hand, giving his psychic spider sense a vision of multiple parade onlookers being in imminent danger of Emilio Helio, the Balloon Man. Yes, Spider-Boy has a lot of joke villains. For instance, the issue opens up with him and Spider-Man taking down Gutterball, a dude with an indestructible bowling ball for a head. I think Dan Slott has to be a Spidey Super Stories fan, so he and Squirrel Girl go to stop Balloon Man, who is described as being like Magneto, but he controls helium instead of metal. So he has a helium tank constantly feeding him helium. This causes him to talk in a forever helium voice, which actually rocks. So a bunch of animal balloons start attacking Spider-Boy and Squirrel Girl, but they have to try to not pop them because they're all filled with attack gases. But while they stop the balloon animals with static cling, some much bigger problems start heading their way. Yeah, Balloon Man has taken control of the parade floats, but Spidey ends up knocking Balloon Man out with the help of none other than Santa Claus, who was fending off the parade floats with the bag of coal that was meant for his naughty list. The last comic we're going over in this special hasn't even come out yet. Yes, we are getting both a Thanksgiving and Christmas cover variant for the new Ultimate Spider-Man series, and they look great. Since the comics have been happening in real time, so to speak, as in the issue that's released in May takes place during May in-universe, I'm sure we'll get a Thanksgiving scene. At least I want to see Peter enjoy a Thanksgiving dinner with his and MJ's loving family. I mean, this is something we should have started to see in the comics like 26 years ago. I thought about waiting to finish this video until the issue was released, but I didn't want to risk that, especially because I need to get to work on the Spider-Man Christmas special. Methinks it's gonna be a juggernaut of a video. But before we end this video, there's one piece of amazing news that I just have to share here. Spider-Man's float is finally returning this year to the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and it looks sensational. It's directly inspired by John Romita Sr.'s artwork. This is serving in part as a celebration of Marvel's 85th anniversary. Man, I cannot wait for this. You can stream the parade at 8:30 on Peacock or watch it live on NBC. There will also be a 2 p.m. re-airing of the parade, which is great news for a night owl like myself. So there it is, folks, the Spider-Man Thanksgiving Day special. If there's any Spidey Thanksgiving-related stuff that you have a personal connection to that wasn't mentioned in this video, leave a comment down below and talk about it. I hope this video added to your holiday season in some way, shape, or form, and although I usually say this at the end of my videos anyway, I feel I really need to express my gratefulness at the end of this video for obvious reasons. Seriously, I cannot believe that I've already started to grow a kick-ass community in the short amount of time I've actually been taking YouTube seriously. I'm always in awe when I see the engagement these videos get, and I can't express my gratitude enough to you all. Seriously, thank you. The next video will be a Spider-Man Christmas special, so stay tuned for that. Lastly, if you're into any of these bands, check out my music. I sincerely hope that all of you have a wonderful Thanksgiving if you celebrate. And if this or any of the upcoming holidays are rough for you for whatever reason, I really do hope these holiday specials at least take your mind off of things for a while. But I gotta get to work on that Christmas special, so peace and love, and I'll see you in the next video.